ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. So welcome everyone to our final event of this year for CAMP, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Project. For some of you who might be newer to our research talk series, but welcome. I just want to give a brief, not even introduction, but more of a recognition of both those who have been involved in making CAMP happen this year and possible. A special thanks to, in addition to my co-director, Dr. Cindy Huang, her wonderful team of students, Emily Hunt, Sylvia Alves Nishioka, Cindy Huang, as well as Gabrielle Tolchin. And so many thanks to them. They've been wonderful in contributing to the talk series, the research initiatives, and really just the infrastructure to make CAMP possible. An additional thanks to many of you who, there are some new faces, but there are also many returning faces, and just thank you for helping to keep this community thriving throughout the year. So I'm just going to very briefly go back to what our CAMP mission is as we prepare to kind of launch this final event. So our mission is really to serve as a platform to join students and faculty across psychology graduate programs here at TC with interest in child and adolescent mental health. And there are really kind of three ways in which we have been hoping to do this: through research, through training, and dissemination and community building. And so today's event is really in service of that third part of our mission. You've heard throughout the academic year from several faculty members about both in and out of TC, about the type of research as well as clinical work that they've been involved in as it's relevant to child and adolescent mental health. And so today, to kind of balance out the many faculty talks, is probably an extremely exciting and maybe even more exciting series of talks from students, from you, to be able to hear about all the exciting research that you've been doing. So today, each talk basically is going to follow the same type of structure. It'll be 7 talks in total that we have. It kind of, as we advertise, it's going to take a form of a data blitz type of format. So each talk is, it was first selected through a competitive review process, blind competitive review process, and these were the abstracts that we thought were exceptionally both appropriate, but also really rigorous in the type of work that they were doing and relevant to this topic. So you'll be hearing each talk for about 9 minutes. It'll be timed, and then we'll have 3 minutes just for Q&A, so certainly feel free after each talk to jump in and ask questions to the speaker. And then there kind of, we were thinking about how to conceptualize this series of 7 talks, and it seemed to really synthesize across 3 different themes. So the first is about high risk and vulnerable youth. So what psychological processes increase risk of mental health related outcomes among youth compared to others? Another theme that you'll see is the family. So what family characteristics influence mental health outcomes among youth? And then the third is beyond the family environment, what other contexts, school or otherwise, influence mental health outcomes among youth? So we've kind of organized and really ordered the talks in service of these themes. As you hear the different talks, just a few things to look out for. There's a really wonderful diversity of kind of angles to each of these talks. And the first, sorry, this is a little out of, great. So the first is that we, meaning the different talks, are covering a distinct array of mental health outcomes, whether that's suicide risk, antisocial behaviors, and psychosocial functioning and emotional functioning broadly. There are multiple methodological approaches that you'll be exposed to, so qualitative studies, case studies, longitudinal studies, as well as treatment and intervention and prevention work. And then there'll also be diverse populations that these studies cover. There's representation across multiple countries, income levels, language abilities, sexual orientations, and gender identities. And then just as a reminder before we get started, to feel free to stay afterwards, where we'll have refreshments as you got a preview of over in the room next door. Okay, so our first talk is by Taylor Walls, and she'll be covering our first theme of high-risk vulnerable youth. Her talk is titled Testing the Directionality of Associations Involving Emotion Dysregulation, Sleep Disturbance, and Suicidal Ideation Among Adolescents. Please join me in welcoming Taylor.
Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm a master's student in the clinical psych department. And as Christine just said, the title of my talk for today is Testing the Directionality of Associations Involving Emotion Dysregulation, Sleep Disturbance, and Suicidal Ideation Among Adolescents. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Christine Cha, as well as Kelly Wilson, who helped me a lot with this sort of project, as well as the LCDS team, without whom this talk would not be possible. So today I'll be talking about a couple of different risk factors for suicidal ideation among adolescents. To start, just by defining suicidal ideation, it's defined as thoughts or desires to end one's own life. And in terms of prevalence, suicide is the third leading cause of death among young adolescents and the second leading cause of death among mid to older adolescents and young adults. And in addition to established risk factors such as depression, hopelessness, and past suicide attempts, emotion dysregulation and sleep disturbance are two other factors that can increase suicide risk among adolescents. So emotion dysregulation is defined as poorly modulated emotional responses, and it has been implicated as one process that can contribute to ideation in adolescence. It is a promising but understudied risk factor of persistent SI in adolescence, and the DIRS, or the Difficulties in Emotion Regulation Scale, is a comprehensive six-factor model measure that has been used to look at emotion regulation in all different kinds of, not only suicidal ideation, but other kinds of psychopathologies. But a couple of years ago, back in 2016, a couple of researchers got together to address some of the psychometric limitations of the DIRS to create the modified DIRS, or the MDIRS, which has 5 dimensions. Identification, so that would be trouble identifying or being aware of what emotions that you're experiencing. Non-acceptance, or non-acceptance of emotional responses. Impulse, or impulse control difficulties. Goals, a lack of goal-directed behavior. And then strategies, or lack of perceived emotion regulation strategies. So consistent and strong correlations between sleep disturbance and suicidal ideation among adolescents has also been detected. As we know, many adolescents experience changes in their sleep as a result of puberty, making them more prone to staying awake later and waking up later. Terminal insomnia, or waking up too early, is one form of insomnia that has been known to predict suicidal ideation in older adolescents. And the QIDS, or the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomatology, is one measure that we use in the lab to assess sleep disturbance. It looks at initial insomnia, or trouble falling asleep, middle insomnia, trouble maintaining sleep during the night, terminal insomnia, trouble waking up too early, and hypersomnia, sleeping too much. So emotion dysregulation and sleep disturbance have both individually been linked to suicidal ideation among adolescents, but there's also a growing body of literature that suggests that emotion and sleep are closely linked, and that the association between the two is complex and also bidirectional. So in one direction, how sleep can affect your emotions. In adolescence, sleep loss can contribute to an increase in negative emotion expression, as well as a diminished ability to implement inhibitory control over negative emotions. While in the converse direction, how emotions can affect your sleep, one piece of evidence that we can look to is that of rumination. Rumination being the emotion dysregulation strategy where repetitive thoughts arise during negative situation or events, and as you're also thinking about the potential consequences of those events. So adolescents experiencing rumination are more prone to pre-sleep intrusive thoughts and have reported poor sleep quality. So there have been conflicting reports in the literature on which subscales of emotion dysregulation and sleep disturbance are more potent than others. Additionally, the MDRS is a pretty new measure that hasn't been widely used yet, and it has not been used to assess emotion dysregulation in a sample like ours. And research has also not explored this sort of bidirectionality as it may pertain to SI in adolescents. And emotion dysregulation and sleep disturbance are both seen as modifiable risk factors in the literature, so it's important to broaden our understanding of such modifiable risk factors so that we can sort of lead to better interventions and mitigate the suicide risk. This leads to our research question: how does emotion dysregulation and sleep disturbance contribute to SI in a community-based sample of adolescents? So we looked at this by way of 3 aims. The first aim was to identify which key dimensions of emotion dysregulation contributed to SI in our sample. And based on the literature, we hypothesized that non-acceptance and strategies would be the 2 dimensions that independently endorse SI in our sample. The second aim was to look at how sleep disturbance would contribute to SI. And again, based on the literature, we hypothesized that terminal insomnia would be the one form of insomnia that would contribute to SI in our sample. And the third aim was to sort of take a look at this bidirectionality and see of emotion dysregulation and sleep disturbance, which was the more proximal correlate of SI. So the first mediation analysis looked at whether emotion dysregulation would mediate or explain the association between sleep disturbance and SI, while the second mediation analysis would switch sort of the independent variable in the mediator such that sleep disturbance would, seeing if sleep disturbance would mediate or explain the relationship between emotion dysregulation and SI. We had 74 adolescents from the community, aged 12 to 19, primarily female. And I already talked about 2 of the assessments. The assessment for our outcome measure, suicidal ideation, we used the SIQ, the Suicide Ideation Questionnaire, which is a 30-item self-report questionnaire. So taking a look at our results, this is the results of aims 1 and 2. So in terms of aim 1, 4 of the 5 dimensions of emotion dysregulation were significantly predicting SI in our sample, all of them except for identification. And for aim 2, initial insomnia was the only significant predictor of SI for our sample. In terms of aim 3, the first mediation analysis was significant. Emotion dysregulation fully mediated the relationship between sleep disturbance and SI, while the second mediation analysis did not prove significant. So sleep disturbance did not mediate the relationship between emotion dysregulation and SI. So again, just to sort of summarize the main findings, it was strategies, non-acceptance, impulse, and goals. Those were the 4 dimensions that contributed to SI in our sample, as well as initial insomnia as the only form of sleep disturbance that contributed to SI, and then only one of the directions that we tested fully mediated the relationship. It was emotion dysregulation that fully mediated the relationship between sleep disturbance and SI. So in terms of limitations, we did solely use self-report measures, and while all of the measures that we used have been compared to sort of gold standard sleep measures, future directions for other research could utilize more objective measures such as sleep restriction or ecological momentary analysis or assessment for sleep disturbance, and like observation or physiological measurement for emotion dysregulation. Strengths of our study was that we were able to identify key subscales of these modifiable risk factors, emotion dysregulation and sleep disturbance. And we were also able to use the MDRS to sort of look at how this measure can sort of identify emotion dysregulation qualities in a sample like this, and sort of its primary evidence that this could be used for both suicidal ideation in adolescents, but also other forms of psychopathology such as depression or eating disorders, alcohol use, etc. And we did examine both sides of the bidirectional relationship. And sort of taken all together, this research has important research and clinical implications for mitigating suicide risk in adolescents, such that more targeted and specialized treatments can be used to identify which perceived emotional and sleep difficulties adolescents are experiencing and target those in treatment. Thank you. Yes. Sure, yes. So let's see, I printed those out. So yes, primarily female, 78.4% female. In terms of racial diversity, it was 27% white, 23% black, 22% Asian, and about 27% other, 30% Hispanic, 70% non-Hispanic. Yeah, pretty diverse. Yes. Yeah. One of the things that I didn't really get to talk about in this 9-minute talk, but one of the things that I was reading about as I was looking at the literature is that sleep is not one of the first, I guess, targets in treatment for adolescents, which is interesting given that so many adolescents experience sleep disturbances. I think maybe because of puberty and because of just like general um, social experiences that adolescents go through, it seems sort of natural that adolescents would be, going to bed later, waking up later, etc. But it seems based on this study and other studies that it could be more. Yeah, it could be more complex than that, and that it could be related to sort of more negative outcomes, such that clinicians should be asking more questions about sleep disturbances and perhaps targeting those earlier in treatment. If that answers your question? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I was surprised, and it kind of speaks to, sort of these conflicting reports about which forms of sleep disturbance are contributing to SI and other forms of psychopathology. I do think it definitely makes sense in terms of the rumination piece. So if you're experiencing initial insomnia and you're not able to fall asleep, it might be because you're thinking about, either something that happened earlier today or something that's going to happen tomorrow or something that could never happen, but it's just like what you're thinking about. So I think it definitely makes sense in terms of that piece. And yeah, I would be curious to see. Yeah, I would be curious to see how it would change or stay the same, both in a clinical sample and then also using other measures like sleep restriction, ecological momentary assessment, etc. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to have to switch back to just to kind of orient all of us. Taylor gave a lovely talk about processes that might be going on within an individual. Now we're going to shift to what might be going on both within individuals, but also within the context in which youth exist and function in everyday life. So the next 3 talks are going to be within the theme of the family. So again, what family characteristics influence mental health outcomes among youth. So we'll have first the talk by Cindy Huang in counseling psychology, talking about bilingualism and parenting factors. and the parent-child relationship in Asian American families. And then that'll be followed by Sylvia Alves Nishioka, a PhD student in the counseling psychology program. And she'll be speaking about examining social validity of a parenting prevention intervention for Asian immigrant parents. And then a final talk of this theme will be by Michael Pelicane, a master's student in the clinical psychology program, who will talk about family acceptance and rejection in sexual and gender minority youth, impact and interventions. So we'll start with Cindy Huang. Sorry for the skipping of the slides. Okay.
All right, hi everyone. Please excuse this congested sound, but my name is Cindy. The title of my talk is Bilingualism, Parenting Factors and Parent-Child Relationships in Asian American Families. So before I talk about my study, I do want to acknowledge some people, including Dr. Cindy Huang. It's hilarious, we have the same name, but she's also my research advisor. What are the chances? And also Dr. Zane. They both helped me with this study and supported me a lot in the research. Also Dr. Yugo Uchikoshi from UC Davis School of Ed. She's the one who gave the bilingualism measure for this particular study. And also Asian Resources Incorporated. It is a nonprofit community center located in Northern California. They helped us recruit community members to participate in this study. All right, so before I talk about my study, I do want to emphasize the importance of studying Asian Americans in this country because it is currently the fastest growing ethnic group in the US. So this is a table that I pulled from the US Census Bureau, listing the population in thousands based on ethnicity. So in 2014, you'll see that I boxed the Asian population. In 2014, there were about, I think, 17 million, which is about only 5% of the population, but in 2060 is projected to grow into about 38 million, so more than 2 times the number. And so the growth is actually 128%. It might not be the largest number in the US, but in terms of growth, it is the highest percentage. And so what does this mean for us as researchers? It means that in the next 50 years, we'll see more Asian American families in this country, and that growth is largely driven by Asian immigration, so immigration from Asian countries. This also means that there will be more families in the US who will be speaking a non-English heritage language. And what do I mean by heritage language? A heritage language is a non-majority language. So in the US, the majority or dominant language is English. In these immigrant families, it would not be English. These are languages spoken or inherited from within the family context. This is especially important for children when developing their ethnic identity, when they're learning about culture. And in these families, a lot of the parents would speak the heritage language, while the children who are born or raised in the US would primarily speak in English or learn English. This might be seen as a discrepancy, but research has demonstrated that this can be a strength, especially when these children can become bilingual. So again, another question, what is bilingualism? For the sake of my study, bilingualism will be defined as the ability to speak and understand 2 languages. I'm not talking about proficiency levels, just the ability. So bilingualism in research is typically associated with better educational outcomes. This means children who are bilingual typically have better reading comprehension in school. They also have this thing called meta-linguistic awareness. They are aware of how words and meanings connect and how to structure a sentence because of their understanding of different language systems. Bilingualism is also typically associated with better executive functioning in children, their abilities to control their behaviors, the use of the prefrontal cortex, and that helps with, for example, when they have 2 different languages in their minds, that they're able to control one and only use another for output. They make an intentional choice about which language to use. And also bilingualism associated with access to cultural community. If you're able to speak the heritage language, you're able to speak different languages, you're able to access the different cultural values and assets of different communities based on the people you speak with. So this image, I recognize it might look a little creepy, I'm sorry, but what I intended to do with this image is that this child in the middle has 2 different languages in their minds. And depending on the social partner, the person he or she's interacting with, this child will make an intentional choice about what language to use. This is particularly important in families because children, they also have to intentionally decide which language to use with their parents. So that actually impacts parent-child relationships. So I wanted to introduce these two terms to you all, the difference between non-reciprocal and reciprocal language use. So within immigrant families specifically, children and their parents may engage in non-reciprocal language use, which means there's a discrepancy, there's a mismatch in the language use between parent and child. Let's say that the parent uses the heritage language while the child uses English. If there's a mismatch, there's a higher chance for conflict, miscommunication, misinterpretation within the family. On the other hand, if the parent and child uses reciprocal language use, there's a match, whether both the parent and child uses English or both the parent and child uses the heritage language. There's, of course, higher levels of communication. When you can speak the same language, you would want to talk to them more. And there's also research that demonstrates that there's higher levels of parental involvement. Parents are more able to be involved in the child's activities because they are able to talk about what the child needs and offer support accordingly. And so it's interesting because this, I would say, influences parenting behaviors, but there's not a lot of research out there talking about that. So parenting behaviors have typically been associated with positive child outcomes. I'll go more in detail about these specific parenting behaviors later when I introduce the measures. But these are some parenting behaviors that are typically associated with positive child outcomes, such as warm and trusting relationships between the child and the parent, more communication, and of course, better mental health. And so the research question that I have for this study is, are there significant differences in parenting behaviors between the parents of these three different groups of children? The children who speak only the heritage language, children who only speak English, or the bilingual children who can speak both English and the heritage language in these families. So the present study, the main criteria that we looked for when recruiting participants is that they had to self-identify as Asian American, and they have to be parents with children between ages 9 to 13. We restricted the age just to look at the adolescent period, so we don't have different data based off of the child age. We had 101 participants, 101 parents who self-reported on parenting behaviors and their child language use. Here's some demographics. Looking at the ethnicity of the participants, the majority of the participants were Vietnamese parents. This is due to the location where we recruited the participants in Northern California. And the second largest group were Hmong, which is an ethnic group located in South or Southeast Asia, mainly along the border of southern China, Vietnam, and Laos. All right, these are the measures. The parents self-reported on their parenting behaviors, on their gender, ethnicity, their acculturation and enculturation levels, basically how comfortable they were engaging in their heritage culture or in mainstream American culture. And here are some of the parenting behaviors. Proactive parenting is how well the parents or how often they give clear choices to their children. Parental monitoring, how often do they know or how well do they know what their child is doing at any given moment, who they're hanging out with. Family routine, that includes how often do you eat with your child, how often do you check up on their homework. Positive parent-child relationship, does your child seek you for comfort when they're upset. Parental engagement, do you do enjoyable activities together? Positive reinforcement, do you compliment, do you affirm your child? And then we also measured conflict. How often do you argue in the family? How often do you get your way by being angry? The child language use measure is basically asking the question, what language does your child use when speaking to you? And again, we're just talking mainly about use and ability, not about proficiency. So the parents were given 5 options to pick from. If the parent picked the first choice, which was only native language, then we would code them as monolingual HL children, monolingual heritage language children. If the parent chose only English, then we would code that as monolingual English children. And then if the parent picked either answer choice 3, 4, or 5, again, we're not looking at proficiency, just the ability. So we coded those 3 choices as bilingual children, and those were our 3 groups. So we ran an ANOVA test to look at the mean differences between these 3 groups. The variables, the parenting factors are all in the left column, and then you can see the differences in the 3 different groups of children. There were 31 parents who reported having children who are monolingual in the heritage language, 35 in monolingual English, and 35 in the bilingual. So you can see that there were significant differences in family routine and family conflict between these 3 groups. So let me explain further. So the first result is that the parents who reported having monolingual heritage language children, they reported less family conflict than the parents of monolingual English children. I think this really lines up with the research that with non-reciprocal language use, there would be more conflict. So with monolingual heritage language children, when they're speaking the same language as their parents, there would be less conflict. So that makes sense to me. The second results, parents of monolingual heritage language children, they scored higher in family routine than parents of monolingual English children. And I think this speaks to the positive parenting behaviors. When they're able to communicate with the child in the same language, there would be more family routine. This third result was a little surprising for me, that parents of bilingual children, so these are the children who speak both English and the heritage language, these parents reported having more family routine than the parents of children who were only monolingual in the heritage language. And after digging through some research, I think it makes sense because when communication is so important in immigrant families, family routines such as eating a meal together may actually help children learn cultural customs and values in the home environment. With bilingual children, when they're engaged in English so often outside the home context, that parents may feel that it is important to teach these cultural customs in the family routines within the social sphere of a family. And so these are some other ideas that was discovered in the research about negotiation, about more parent-child interactions, and how language can be a protective factor for immigrant families. When the entire outside world is speaking a language that you do not understand, the family is a safe place where you can use the heritage language to speak with people that you really care about. Here's some limitations. We couldn't look at directionality because the information was gathered from a self-report survey all at once. I'd be curious to see if there's, an actual influence between parenting factors and child language use, and is it bidirectional? I'd be curious to see if acculturation and enculturation impacts parent language use in the family, as well as child language use. And I'd be curious to see if there are assessments who can assess for language proficiency in the child. So here's some implications for practice for those of us who work with children, who work with families, especially Asian immigrant families. I think it'd be important for us to consider the impacts of language use on family dynamics, how language can impact conflict in the family, how it can impact the sharing of cultural values, and how parents and children can better negotiate using reciprocal language. Thank you. Any questions? So the research that I've looked into so far is that there could potentially be a bidirectional influence, that parenting behaviors, parents will intentionally, probably tell the child, I would like for you to speak the heritage language in the family context. So based off of what the parent wants, they may enforce certain routines, enforce certain practices at the home to make sure that the child speaks that language. Also, if the child intentionally uses either English or the heritage language in response to the parent, that may also influence them to use either positive or negative parenting behaviors in response. So I think that bidirectionality is very important, but again, with this current study, I couldn't assess for that, but I'd be curious to see in future studies if that bidirectionality actually is present. I think that's a very good question. There's not a whole lot of research about language use in specifically a clinical relationship, but I can see how that may impact, for example, if you are a clinician working with a parent and a child and you're seeing the conflict happening and you're wondering if there could be a misinterpretation in what is being discussed, if this same interaction is also happening in the home environment, that you as a clinician can speak to that in the present moment while you're processing with them, I think that would be powerful. But again, the research does not say anything about that currently, so I'd be curious to see as well. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think all the research that I found so far has only been self-report from one parent. And that would be interesting because, in parenting, one parent may be parenting a certain way, using certain parenting behaviors, and the other may not. So I'd be curious to see it in a family intervention kind of setting to see if there would be differences in language use based off the different parenting styles of the different parents. So I think that'd be interesting as well. So I think the theme is there's not a whole lot of research out there about language use, particularly within the family context, and when we're thinking about parent-child relationships. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So this is going to be easy because it's a nice segue from Cindy's presentation. My work is called Examining Social Validity of a Parenting Prevention Intervention for Asian Immigrant Parents. So some of these will be repeated based on what Cindy just told us about Asian Americans here in the United States. What we are trying to highlight here in this presentations really the health disparities that they unfortunately experience right now, meaning they unfortunately do have less access and engagement, lower rates of engagement in services. And specifically when we are thinking about youth, it's important to engage parents because they are the keepers of the youth access to those treatments. So when we are trying to reach it out, bridge these health disparities that we notice that the literature has consistently reported, we want to understand how can we engage parents and the family as a whole to then access and improve youth outcomes. And here we are also thinking about what is the importance and acceptability of these interventions for a specific group. So we cannot assume necessarily that all the treatments are equally valid or equally accepted across different groups. So what are the perceptions that a specific cultural group has about a treatment, how we can then modify this treatment to make it more accessible, more engaging, and ultimately serve better these groups that have been experiencing so many disparities. So we are here, on this presentation, we'll be focusing on a family intervention that is called the family checkup. It's a preventive intervention that's very structured and really focusing on positive parenting behaviors, how we can promote those parenting behaviors to then positively affect the youth. So here, we noticed on previous studies that we have conducted that actually Asian parents have been rating this family checkup intervention less socially valid compared to white parents. So basically they are having these descriptions of the intervention, they are making ratings of it, and they are actually saying this does not sound something that I will engage as often as white parents. So here we are interested in this study then to understand why. And our hypothesis is how culture can inform these social validity ratings. And understanding those cultural factors, what it may be involved, can help us to increase engagement in these Asian parents. Okay. So our aim, to put it out clear there, is to examine how parenting behaviors are related to the social validity ratings of the family checkup among Asian immigrant parents. And I should highlight here, we are choosing parenting behaviors because we know from research that they are very much informed by the cultural values around child rearing practices. So it may look very different for an Asian parent raising their kid compared to a white, Western, culturally based parent raising their kid too. So because the family checkup is so heavily focused on parenting behaviors, we are assuming that these parenting behaviors will be slightly different in these two groups. So how these parenting behaviors will be influencing then their perceptions of the intervention itself. Is that clear? Okay. So I do not want to repeat, but the data set is basically the same as Cindy just described for us very nicely. Thank you. And we are using here the 101 Asian immigrant parents self-report. And to analyze, conduct this study, we analyzed through multiple regressions. So each of the social validity subscales will be one outcome. And we are trying to determine the relationship between the social validity subscales to acculturation, enculturation, parenting behaviors, to see what may be affecting those ratings. So really briefly, we just saw this. This is our sample, very diverse within the Asian ethnicity. Slightly education level, it's high school mostly, but we do have some parents who finished college and mostly mothers responding, which is very common in family research. Moving on to the results, and here really wanted to point it out, we just saw the first part of the table about acculturation and enculturation. I do want to say that the difference here is basically acculturation being you as an immigrant being adapting and adjusting to your host culture. So basically focusing on American culture. And enculturation, how much you still feel attached and practice your heritage culture, and could be anything, basically. So these are two different concepts, but bear in mind they are in a continuum, and that's important for understanding our results too. And we have here the reliability coefficients and the means. Moving down the table, we see the parenting behaviors. Cindy also talked about those very briefly. We are looking into proactive parenting, parental monitoring, family routine, positive relationship, parenting engagement, and positive reinforcement. So these are the main parenting behaviors that we're focusing on the family checkup. So we are also looking how they may affect the social validity. Social validity, talking about it, we are breaking it down into different subscales, into how much they understand, the parents understand the intervention itself. So basically, based on this description, do you understand what is being proposed to you? First step. And we are also assessing how reasonable they find the intervention to be. Following that, how willing they are to engage in this proposed intervention, how they perceive its effectiveness, which is an important point. They're only engaging on something that they feel it will work for them. And lastly, and also very important, how much disruption they think the intervention will bring for their family routines, for their lives in general. They are parents will be less likely to engage in something that they find very disruptive. They don't have the time or it's too demanding. So we are trying to really break it down and understand what would be relevant for this group. Here's a picture, a figure really summarizing our findings of our regression. And we found some significant relationships. Those parenting behaviors on the bottom, they don't come as significant results, so we are not including them on our discussions. Very interesting, and I'm going to talk in a few minutes. Do pay attention to the acculturation and enculturation. They are opposite directions, so and they are related to reasonableness. Okay, let me rush. So first, understanding, very simply put, higher levels of education would increase understanding of the intervention. And that's quite straightforward. And we also relate that to mental health literacy, how much they know about mental health in general. And that's also associated with higher levels of education. Parental engagement was also positively associated with understanding. The more the parents are engaged in their children's activities, the more they would understand the intervention, possibly because it makes sense for them. They are already doing many of those things. How reasonable they found the family checkup to be was a very interesting result, because we actually found that higher enculturation would also be related to higher reasonableness, meaning parents that endorse a lot of their heritage culture values will also endorse that, yeah, I find this intervention to be reasonable. I think that's something interesting, which is very surprising for us. And on the other hand, acculturation was negatively associated. So the more they would be acculturated to US culture, the less reasonable they will find the intervention. And we were really puzzled by this result. It's very interesting, and I want to spend all my time here because it's the most interesting part, actually. And we thought that maybe this is related to the biculturalism, and that's very interesting, following up Cindy's results, too. Our sample is specifically very bicultural. We can see by the means on the last point. They're basically the same. This is a scale ranging from 0 to 10, and they both follow right in the middle, which is a high indication that these parents may be very bicultural. They can move really well between their own culture, heritage culture, and American culture, meaning there's something there about also being bicultural that can be important for family perceptions about interventions that we are proposing for them. And what is important here is that enculturation has not been as much studied and investigated compared to acculturation. So future research should definitely focus on that, how heritage values and culture can also improve engagement in treatment interventions. And I'm very sorry, I'm out of time. I really want to jump, I'm so sorry. I really want to jump to these because I want to acknowledge my advisor who helped me with this research, and also Dr. Nolan Zane, who put up the grant for this data collection. Thank you. Sorry, I ran out of time. Yeah. We think it's very, it was very interesting to find that, and basically meaning that this relationship between acculturation and enculturation is not clearly understood, and less so in their impact to the family engagement into treatment, perceptions into treatment. So basically, we're thinking that there may be values in the Asian culture that do relate to the parenting intervention that we are talking about, the family checkup, and do reinforce that those strategies, they may think that that's a valuable thing. On the other hand, what about being an immigrant in this country that also may put barriers to this engagement, to these perceptions? So not 100% sure what we are actually tapping on, but really would be really important to delve into that and understand better the enculturation part too. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and we are totally open to that. Actually, we are trying the broader goal of these whole study is actually to understand what are the important factors in this intervention that we can change and adapt to make it more valid and more relevant for this specific group. So our goal is not absolutely not kind of hold to this intervention, say it's perfect. It's really the opposite, how we can improve it to make it more relevant, and that may involve even changing the intervention itself. Right. Yeah, that's a great thought. I personally did not run this analysis, but that's a great point. They are they're correlated for sure. They are part of the same scale. We overall, there are relevant differences, and the differences differ also per scale. But that's a great way of thinking also about it. Thank you.
And so next, also within our theme of family, is Michael Pelicane.
So I'm just going to jump right in. So this talk is mainly based off of a manuscript that's in preparation with some colleagues of mine at the Ackerman Institute for the Family, specifically their Gender and Family Project. So first I would like to acknowledge Jean Malpas and Lizzie Glazer, who's a counseling student here at TC, for their help with this data project. Okay, so there are two main research questions that this project is trying to address. The first is, how do family acceptance and rejection impact the psychological and health outcomes in sexual and gender minority youth? And the second is, what interventions exist for increasing family acceptance and reducing family rejection in families with sexual and gender minority youth? And so the Gender and Family Project, also called GFP, is using two methods really to address these questions. The first is conducting a literature review on the role of family acceptance in the mental health of this population. And the second is conducting research with families to explore the effect of family acceptance on transgender and gender nonconforming youth specifically, and the potential for a intervention that was developed at the Gender and Family Project. So first, how do the constructs of family acceptance and rejection relate specifically to this population? As with more general constructs of family acceptance and rejection, families can simultaneously exhibit accepting and rejecting behaviors regarding a child's sexual or gender minority status. So examples of accepting behaviors include saying, "I love you," inviting the child's partner over, or telling others about the child's identity. And rejecting behaviors include name-calling, refusing to talk about the child's identity, to physical and sexual abuse. So given this wide array of possible reactions to a child's disclosure of their identity, sexual and gender minority individuals experience rejection sensitivity specific to their minority identity. Finally, it's important to distinguish between more general acceptance and rejection from the family compared to specifically acceptance and rejection of the child's sexual and gender minority status, since a family could be accepting of their child in a general sense, but may not be accepting of their minority identity. So first we're going to focus on sexual minority youth, so this includes gay, lesbian, and bisexual youth. Family reactions to a child's quote-unquote coming out can range quite widely, and this can range from complete acceptance of the child to violence and abuse. And as you'd expect, family rejection of a child's sexual orientation is associated with a number of negative outcomes, including higher depressive symptoms, higher anxiety, greater substance use, risky sexual behaviors, and suicidal ideation and attempts. And this type of rejection, this sexuality-specific type of support, impacts the child's mental health above and beyond more general support for the child. Meanwhile, family acceptance of a child's sexual orientation is associated with fewer depressive symptoms, lower anxiety, lower substance use, higher self-esteem and acceptance, and lower suicidal ideation and attempts. Yet, despite the demonstrated importance of sexuality-specific support for this population, this kind of support from families is perceived as less available than other support in other domains. And while family rejection of a child's sexual orientation certainly has an effect on the child, it can also negatively impact the functioning of the family as a whole. Another important group within this umbrella is gender nonconforming youth. And this population can be defined as gender expression during childhood that doesn't conform to the typical expression of the child's assigned sex at birth. And gender nonconforming behaviors can exist regardless of a child's gender identity or sexual orientation. While parents should serve as a source of support for these vulnerable children, gender nonconforming children actually have lower social support and poorer relationships with parents compared to their gender-conforming peers. And as you would expect, family rejection of gender nonconformity is associated with suicidality and substance use. And family acceptance of a gender nonconforming child can buffer against these negative psychosocial outcomes that may derive often from peer victimization. Nevertheless, many families try to correct their child's gender nonconforming behavior to be more in line with behavior typical of their child's assigned sex at birth. But such tactics, and they often try to justify these tactics as a means of fitting in, but these can have negative psychological impacts that on the child's mental health that extend far into adulthood. Finally, and more relevant to GFP, is the role of family acceptance in transgender youth. Not surprisingly, the majority of families react negatively to a child's disclosure of their transgender identity. And while parent attitudes tend to improve over time, the impact of their initial rejection can still be significant. Family rejection of a child's transgender identity is associated with homelessness, engagement in sex work, substance abuse, and suicide attempts, while family acceptance of a child's transgender identity is associated with better physical health, higher self-esteem, lower depression, safe sex practices, lower suicidal ideation, and fewer suicide attempts. As with childhood gender nonconformity, the line between acceptance and rejection may not be so clear-cut, since parents' concern is oftentimes for the safety of their child, given the high rates of victimization that exist among transgender youth. However, an overemphasis on safety concerns can prevent the child from engaging in behaviors that may ultimately affirm their gender identity. So a number of interventions have been looked at in the literature to improve family acceptance and decrease family rejection in sexual and gender minority populations. First and foremost, psychoeducation is very important. Educating families on what transgender identity is, how it develops, and the importance of affirmation of the child's gender identity is very helpful for improving family acceptance. In terms of more structured interventions, attachment-based family therapy has been found to help family members work through their emotions and explore meaning and consequences of accepting their sexual and gender minority child. And this intervention has been found to lower suicidality, depressive symptoms, and anxiety in these children. Even something as simple as watching a film-based intervention has been shown to increase family acceptance. So the interventions don't have to be big to have a significant impact on families. Unfortunately, though, some may never be accepting of their sexual and gender minority child. So it's important to develop resilience in these children to deal with their parents' non-acceptance. And there is definitely a lack of empirically supported interventions to increase family acceptance and decrease family rejection. And this is definitely an area that the Gender and Family Project specifically is trying to address through their own research. So what the Gender and Family Project does is they run support groups for parents, children, and siblings of specifically trans and gender nonconforming youth. And they conduct family therapy with these youth and their families using something called the multidimensional family approach. And they also collect research data from these families who are seeking services. And currently we have intake data from almost 400 families who have sought these services. So here's just some basic demographic information about our current makeup of the families seeking services. As you can see, the number of families who have come to GFP has exploded. And oftentimes these families are with youth who are very young and maybe at the very early stage of their transition. We have a lot of diversity in terms of the gender identity of the youth who come to us, and also in terms of where they are in their social transition. Some may just be at the very beginning stages of coming out to their families and to others, while others may be spending full time in their affirmed identity in a variety of social contexts. And so some preliminary data analysis that we've done on this intake data, we found, not surprisingly, that parental acceptance of a child's gender identity is significantly associated with the child's self-acceptance of their own gender identity. And we found similar results to siblings' acceptance of the transgender child as well. We're currently in the process of collecting follow-up data from these families. I think last I checked, we've gotten 18 back. We're really just starting. And hopefully in the future, we're thinking about running an intervention study to see if the multidimensional family approach that GFP uses is an effective treatment for this population. Thank you. Yeah, so I don't personally run the intervention. I would not describe myself as an expert. Jean has written a peer-reviewed journal article that describes it in extensive detail, and I'd be happy to send it to you. I actually have it right here if you'd like to take a look at it. Generally, it focuses, first it has the parents and child separate to try and get an understanding for where they're coming at, and try to affirm both the parent and the child's concerns, and then to bring them together and try to negotiate those two groups. And they also involve parent support groups and child support groups so that they can get help from other parents in terms of getting medical care and psychological care. Yeah, so these correlations specifically are taken from one item, basically just asking how accepting are you currently of your child's gender identity, and how, I should note that for this, the child self-acceptance is parent-reported, so that's kind of a limitation, but hopefully we're collecting data from children as well. And there are measures out there that we've since incorporated into our current iteration of the intake form. Yeah. Yeah. Completely anecdotally, just from having looked through all of these intake forms, I think a lot of the parents of younger kids are, when they see their child engaging in gender nonconforming behavior, they think it's more of a phase, that they'll grow out of it and develop more gender typical behaviors. Whereas with the parents of older children, they're more solidified in terms of their own gender identity. So they're kind of go in with the understanding that this is who their child is. Thank you.
Okay, so if you could just close your eyes really quickly while I try to go to our orienting slide here. Okay. So thank you all for sticking with us. We're in our our third phase of talks. Okay, so in our third phase of talk, sorry guys, I don't know how to get to the, oh, got it. Okay. So our third phase of talks is pertaining to a different set of contexts, a broader set of contexts, so school and other contexts. Beyond the family environment, what other contexts influence mental health outcomes among youth? So we have a joint talk across Cheryl Fu, Lily Downing, and I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, Nadine Postolache. Okay. From both counseling and clinical psychology. So they'll be presenting both a case study as well as pilot results from a multi-level university school mental health program. And then we'll finish up with Shrishti Sardana from the clinical psychology program, where she'll be speaking about listening for alternative stories, a novel qualitative approach to the study of vulnerable juvenile offenders in India. So with that, please join me in welcoming Cheryl, Lily, and Nadine. I will zoom ahead. Tell me when you see it. Is it this one?
Yes.
Okay,
exactly.
perfect.
Okay, so hi
everyone. My name is Nadine Postalake, and today, together with Cheryl and Lily, we're going to present on the school-based mental health collaboration, which we are all of a part of in different capacities, also known as SBMHC. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge our large team. We have a large team of wonderful members, and specifically our director, Dr. Nancy Upperwolf, who's here, and our supervisors, our clinical supervisors. So we don't have time to kind of acknowledge everybody, but it kind of speaks to, this large team speaks to the collaborative endeavor that this project is. So we're going to do something a little bit different today. I'm going to introduce SBMHC, its theoretical underpinnings, and then Lily's going to present more of the clinical side of SBMHC and talk about a case that she's worked with throughout the year, and then Cheryl will talk about the research side and present on a pilot study. So what is SBMHC? So first and foremost, it's a collaborative partnership between Teachers College and New York City Public Schools. It's a consultative multi-level intervention. So you can see with licensed clinical supervisors and graduate student classroom consultants in the middle, we really try to go in and intervene on a school-wide way and create this social emotional framework for the school. So we work with all school stakeholders, children and their families, teachers in the classrooms, principals and the schools, and also the community-based providers. And just, it's a fairly recent, relatively recent program. It started in 2016, and we don't have much time to kind of go through the timeline, but basically it's important to note that it's gone through multiple phases up until now. And so at its core, we really look at children from a developmental and holistic perspective. So we really take into account not just the neurology of the child, but also the age of the child and the multicultural identities that the child is bringing, and as well as we look at not only those aspects for the child, but also for stakeholders in general. And so we base our model, SBMHC's model, on psychoanalytic principles, including attachment theory and mentalization theory. But it's important to note that we don't use these theories in a conventionally in the clinical diagnosis way that we conventionally think about, but more of as a way to inform our conceptualization of the interactions that we have with teachers and with the children. So from attachment theory, we all know sort of that early child-parent relationships act as a secure base for which children can explore the world. And if it is insecure attachment at early childhood, this can have an impact on the child's peer relationships, their relationships with the teacher. So we really take into account the child's attachment style and how this could impact their emotional regulation, their peer relationships in the classroom, their relationships with the teachers, and the materials in the classroom as well. And we go even deeper by looking at the teacher's attachment style and how, when we work with the teacher, understanding that style and its impact in our interventions with the teacher and our dynamics with the teacher. And then finally, we also draw upon mentalization theory, which is the ability to understand one's own mind and one's own mental and not only one's own mental states, but others' mental states as well. So this is keeping the stakeholders' perspectives mind in our mind when we are intervening at the schools. So really thinking about where they're coming from and understanding that and taking that all into account as we do our interventions as classroom consultants in the school. And we do have two models that operationalize mentalization. One is the STORE model, which is a trauma-focused model. The schools that we work in tend to be high needs. There's a high population of children of color and a high rate of trauma too in these populations. So we do use sort of trauma-focused models. And so we each have served as classroom consultants, and Lily and I currently serve as classroom consultants. Cheryl did in the past, and our role in the classroom is quite complex. We do several things at once. So during the week, we'll observe the classroom dynamics and the teacher and student interactions. We'll co-teach a social emotional learning lesson with the teacher and hope to integrate this into the mainstream classroom culture. We'll do push in and pull out interventions in the classroom while we're there on the days that we're there. We'll hold a teacher coaching session once a week with the teacher, kind of workshopping interventions that they could do to reinforce the social emotional learning lesson. And then we'll, for children who need more than what we can provide in the classroom during the week, we'll actually meet for a parent consultation and triage and connect them with community-based services. So what do the interventions look like? There are a ton of things that we do, but to focus on one in specific, it's the social emotional learning lesson. And this is not just the 25 to 30 minutes that we teach themes such as these on the posters in the images, but also we want to help the teacher in the workshop adapt and expand upon the content and reinforce this and to make it really a classroom culture rather than just a subject that they teach like math or science. And then we also have interventions that we're building off of, and I'll let Lily kind of talk about that in the context of a case, but we have these interventions that are coming from the theoretical underpinnings of SBMHC.
In his life. So now I'm going to pass it on to Cheryl, and she's going to talk about the study, the pilot study.
Thank you, Lily. So we evaluated the preliminary effectiveness of our program in the 2017 school year, and we sought to answer the research questions. 1, does SBMHC affect teachers' attitudes and practices towards mental health in the classroom? And 2, does SBMHC affect students' internalizing, externalizing, and pro-social behaviors? And 3, if there were, what may explain the different findings across the schools? So we had the buy-in of 2 elementary schools in Upper Manhattan to pilot SBMHC in 2017 in half of their classrooms. So for each school, there were 2 classrooms per grade, so that allowed us to have grade matched intervention and control classrooms. In school 1, we had 6 intervention classrooms and 3 control classrooms. And in school 2, we had 6 intervention and 6 control classrooms. We had 1 intervention teacher in school 2 which dropped out, left the school mid-year, and so we lost the teacher ratings of student effects in that class as well. And so in total, we collected data from 20 classrooms minus the dropout students and collected data from 23 teachers in total. And so using an original survey for teacher outcomes, teachers' self-reported attitudes and practices towards classroom mental health were collected at the beginning of fall 2017 and at the end of spring 2018. And to measure children's behaviors, teachers filled out a strengths and difficulties questionnaire for each student in their classroom pre and post intervention as well. And throughout, we also collected implementation data through Classroom Consultant's weekly progress notes, where the classroom consultant has to check off which responsibilities she performed that day, rate the overall effectiveness of the SEL lesson and student participation in the SEL lesson, the length of the classroom observation and teacher coaching sessions she had that week, and the students that she intervened with. So all of those speak to the implementation variables of fidelity, quality, responsiveness, dosage, and reach of intervention. And at the end of the year, the teachers in the intervention group also gave feedback on the experience of the program and the CC that they worked with. So to analyze the teacher's effects, we used linear regression of post-test on intervention group status, controlling for pre-test scores, teachers' years of experience, and class size. And to analyze child effects, we used a mixed model with random intercepts so that we can make inferences on the broad population and controlling for the same variables as well. So this is the school characteristics at baseline, meaning the 2016 to 2017 year. And this data was pulled from the NYC DOE school quality guide that is available publicly. And the schools were comparable in terms of student demographics and poverty levels. And the key differences were that School 1 actually implemented SBMHC in 1 classroom and 1 grade in the previous year. So SBMHC already had a presence in the school prior to our pilot study. And School 1 also had more teachers with more than 3 years of experience. School 2 had a higher number of external partnerships and externally run program compared to School 1, which had none prior to the inception of SBMHC. And School 2's teachers rated higher on instructional leadership and program coherence. So looking at the teacher effects, the table presents the coefficient for the intervention group, and we found that there were marginal effects on teacher attitudes in School 1 and no effects on changes in teacher practices in School 1. We found no effects on teacher attitudes and practices in School 2. And with regards to student effects, we found that in School 1, after the inception of SBMHC, there was a decrease in conduct problems and a decrease in hyperactivity and inattention behaviors, and there were no effects on emotional symptoms, peer problems, or prosocial behaviors. And in School 2, we did not find any effects on student behaviors based on the teacher report. And now, looking at the implementation and satisfaction results, we found that compared to CCs in School 1, CCs in School 2 reported conducting less SEL lessons and less classroom observations. They also reported conducting classroom observations and teacher coaching for a lower amount of time. And they rated SEL lessons as significantly less effective. They had lower student participation and also observed more externalizing problems during the SEL lessons. And with regards to the teacher satisfaction, there was no significant differences between School 1 and School 2 in the intervention group. So revisiting the research questions. 1, does SBMHC affect teachers' attitudes and practices towards mental health in the classroom? SBMHC increased teachers' ratings in the importance of understanding the meaning behind students' behaviors and the value of social-emotional learning at School 1 only. With regards to practices and the frequency with which teachers discuss social-emotional competencies at the class, there was no change at either school. And 2, does SBMHC affect students' internalizing, externalizing, and prosocial behaviors? SBMHC reduced students' conduct problems and hyperactive and inattentive behaviors at School 1 only, and it did not reduce peer or emotional problems or promote prosocial behaviors at either school based on teacher report. So what may explain different findings across school? There are some key variables of difference between School 1 and School 2. Firstly, that SBMHC may have been effective at School 1 only because it was in its second year of implementation, whereas SBMHC was in its inaugural year at School 2. School 2 also had 9 existing partnerships prior to collaborating with and implementing SBMHC, and so they might have already been saturated with training and adopting more than one evidence-based programs in their school system. School 1 also had a weaker relationship with the principal. And anecdotally, we tried to make sense of this, and this may have influenced teachers' agency and proactivity to be involved in the program. And School 1, based on CC report, also had higher program fidelity, higher program dosage, and higher receptiveness to the SEL lesson. So implementations lesson learned. It's important for us to assess pre-implementation measure factors such as whether the school has the capacity, the resources, and the buy-in to implement a new program in the school, and perhaps a full year of implementation may be necessary before the program impacts on the teachers and students can be detected. And I spoke a little bit to both Nadine and Lily about what they felt were the most helpful component of the intervention, especially since it's such a varied intervention. And they both underscored the collaborative partnership across the stakeholders and bridging all the ecosystems of a child in order to deliver an integrated intervention for the child. And some things that we're trying to address in our intervention is how systemic barriers such as poverty and school and the low school and community resources may affect alliance building with the teachers and parents, and how to be more integrated in the classroom and the school system in order to really change the culture of mental health in the school. So overall, SBMHC is a really promising and unique model, especially for resource-strapped and high needs population, and it can really have the potential to enhance and improve student behavior and enhance teacher capacity in identifying, understanding, and advocating for mental health in the classroom. Thank you.
we probably have all faced that challenge, and I think as long as we try to keep our students in the center of the room, we can kind of do both at the same time because they know that we are there to support them. Even though it's not every day, it's like we can put in constructs in the classroom that can help them to feel safer when we're not there. But it's a huge challenge. I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, these teachers are worked very hard and face a lot of difficult situations.
Yeah, I think that the blurry line between, that's a great question, and I think the blurry line between being like a consultant in that role versus and trying to avoid being a therapist is one that we have to navigate a lot going in as clinical trainees, but then also recognizing that there are moments in teacher coaching that you can bring in some psycho-ed because we're talking about social emotional learning, so using that as a way to talk to the teacher about mental health in general and emotional self-regulation. That's something that we bring into teacher coaching also on a weekly basis.
So I used to be a teacher, and one of the hardest parts of my day for helping students with mental health was gaining the support from family members. So I'm curious, like, number one, if that, like, if that was a struggle for you all meeting with parents, like, as one of the stakeholders, and also if there were resistance, there was resistance with them, and how did you work through that barrier?
Oh, there's so many experiences of resistance of the system failing, and at the same time, like breakthroughs that you have with the parents. So it really, it is a place where a lot of the teachers get stuck in terms of parent outreach and bringing parents in. Their work schedules, the work hours, they're typically working throughout the day and can't meet during the school time when we're there. That's a barrier. But I think that there have been some breakthroughs in particular instances with some of the kids where we have been able to establish a relationship, an ongoing relationship, and get them sort of to buy into the program.
Yeah, and I also think too, like being flexible. I mean, I think both communicate with parents in ways that we probably didn't think we would initially, like whether it's sending a text message to them as a reminder that we have a meeting. So knowing that, no matter how well you're trained in like, okay, you're going to bring them in for an intake, you'll send them an email, and they'll come in and navigating, they'll need maybe more reminders, one parent will, and then having like major surprises in other families that, show up 20 minutes early, it's like the little things that you just have to stay flexible.
Thank you.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, we have Shrishti Sardana.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for holding fort until the end of the showcase today. It's such an honor to be here. And also to have Louise Carmichael, who's my supervisor, collaborator, now a great friend, Skype in from India, from Australia. It's 5:30 there or so in the morning. And I caught her on the spot, but it's such a beautiful room and she gets to see all my colleagues. And I wish Louise was here, but I'm going to do the best that I can to represent the work that we did in India a few years ago and where we stand today. So the presentation, Listening for Alternative Stories, touches upon a novel qualitative approach to studying one of the hardest to access, hardest to study populations in the country, which are juvenile offenders in institutional care. So my thanks are owed to, of course, the Special Juvenile Police Unit, which is also my former workplace where I was a corrections officer, and the Department of Women and Child Development, whom we interfaced with as we were thinking about developing psychosocial rehabilitation programs for juveniles for the first time. The universities that helped sponsor voluntary work of several interns that worked on this project over time, and the Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard's, the Australian Prime Minister's Asia Award that allowed Louise to travel to India, stay there, work, and initiate this work with me. So very quickly, some of the operational definitions are a child in conflict with law under a certain section of the Indian Penal Code is defined as someone who's under 18 and is alleged or found to have committed an offense and is currently being held for that offense. Juvenile delinquency is the habitual committing of criminal acts or offenses by a young person, especially one that is identified as minor. An observation home or a juvenile jail, but we'll use observation home in this presentation, is an institution where both neglected and delinquent juveniles are held until a decision is taken on the next steps of the offense that they've committed. So either they would be held there for a duration of about 3 years, or they would be released back into the community, which then speaks to recidivism rates that I'll come to in a second. And a probation or corrections officer is someone who's appointed to investigate, report on, and supervise the conduct of the juveniles while they're held. So we play many roles as a corrections officer. Mental health is not one of them. Juveniles in conflict with law, or JCLs, account for about 16% of serious violent crimes in the country. And about 1/3 of them are linked with property crimes. The one thing to keep in mind here is the very high rate of repeat offenders that you see in 2011 and 2012. It's far greater for juveniles than it is for adults. And then that rate lowers a little bit, but that is not a true representation. Something happened in December 2012 in the country, which made for international media attention, which was a very brutal gang rape of a young woman in which a juvenile was involved, which led to actually the revision of the policy in the country and allowed for 16 to 18-year-old young boys to be tried as adults, which was not the case. And that reflects in why the recidivism rate is low, which is not a true decrease, but it's a function of the change in the policy. So some of the risk factors that have been identified in literature, and a couple that become certainly pertinent to the work that Luis and I did in India, include personal characteristics like limited income, education, or unstable family structure, certain environmental risk factors such as belonging to a disadvantaged region in the state, or other health factors such as child neglect and abuse, malnutrition, and inadequate physical activity in developmental years have been linked to a high risk for delinquency. Certain gender-specific factors are implicated for males as aggression or exposure to peers and gangs at an early age. And among women or girls, it's been linked with childhood maltreatment and other mental health factors in the family. Now, where we came in, I was employed as a corrections officer and Luis was visiting India. And we noticed that there was little to no acknowledgement of pathology from criminal behavior in the observation home that I was employed at. So we said, well, there is very little scope of developing a robust research design, but what is the best that we can do? Is there something here among these boys that we might be able to capture that can help them just a little bit, because their stay in the home is so transient and we don't know for how long they're here. And when they go back, what are some of the forces that will keep them there, and in terms of safety and protection? So some of the guiding questions were, how can we respond to boys in conflict with law who are fairly young, like ages 7 to 16, once they've entered the juvenile justice system? What opportunity, if any, does the short incarceration in the observation home provide for psychosocial, emotional, or social rehab? And when it is time for these boys to leave the home, could they think differently about themselves and their future possibilities? It's fairly straightforward. And the sample was interesting. We recruited by chance because I was there. But at the same time, we were very careful of not including boys who were convicted of heinous crimes such as rape or other sexual violence, because they get tried differently in the court of law, and they have very different court proceedings, very different laws that govern their protection laws in the home. So it's very hard to consent them for participation in programs. So they volunteered, and we requested staff who were not directly linked. So each probation officer is linked to a certain number of boys in the home. We made sure that those were not the staff members who were recruiting the boys for this program. So we recruited an independent staff member to ask for participation from the boys that they weren't directly involved in the care of. Ultimately, 6 Hindi-speaking, which is the national language of the country, 6 Hindi-speaking staff members participated. one female corrections officer was me who co-facilitated the program, and juveniles in conflict with law, there were 27 of them, and the mean range was, age was 13 years and 8 months. Now, this is really the home, and there's a cricket pitch. How many of us are familiar with the game of cricket? Okay, kind of, sort of, okay. Very colonial, but it's a very good inheritance for us. So we started a 5-day psychosocial intervention using a cultural metaphor for these boys. The team of life was not a new approach to narrative work. In fact, it's a narrative methodology that was developed by David Dunborough, and it enables young people to talk about their lives through sporting metaphors. So for example, in Uganda, when this study was first done, they used the metaphor of football for child soldiers. And so in India, where cricket becomes so pertinent and is embraced by young boys, it was our metaphor of choice. So literally, we played the game. We started the first day with playing cricket with both staff and boys in the field. There was no difference in who took the leadership position. It was divided in 2 teams of 11 players each. Both staff and boys were intermingled. We started to play a game of cricket. The important part was when we reconvened after the game, what were some of the questions that we posed to them? And there were 2. 1, what do you like, enjoy, or value most about cricket? And do you also value these things in other areas of your life? And we noted down their responses. The following day, the theme was the spirit of the game, which was guided by two other questions. What are some of the important things about the spirit of the game to you? Fairly open. And then, are these the same things that are important to you in other parts of your life? Day 3 was about reading back the words and the stories that they'd been sharing with us on days 1 and 2. And day 4 was about naming the opposition team in terms of what are you up against and what are you battling for. We analyzed these themes using a framework approach in qualitative research that is quite typical of ethnographic work. And our results were rather surprising. From day 1, they learned for the very first time to negotiate trust and confidentiality. These are boys among whom the very notion of keeping safe each other's stories didn't exist. So we actually came up with this local metaphor where they made a chalk mark in the field and said whoever would be ready to keep each other's stories safe will enter the circle of trust, and those who wouldn't should step out. And actually one boy didn't consent and stepped away and said, I don't think I want to hold anybody's story safe. The second day brought up an important theme of being encouraged and supported for the first time. It brought about a sense of finding happiness in the happiness and hard work as being important for the very first time for these boys. An important skill was therefore to make regrets useful. If I lost a match, it doesn't mean I can't play again. The third day was when we read the stories back to them. That night before, Luis and I sat up to reframe the stories that they had shared with us, including things that they find very difficult in their lives, things that make them very hopeless or interfere with their day-to-day life and their moods. And we had to reframe these stories and present them back to the boys in a way that it presents strength and positive outcomes. And one of the boys actually said, I like that we were one voice. No one was singled out in the game. You took all the good stuff and left all the bad stuff out. All the mistakes which we should have never said, you omitted. The boys affirmed their desire to retain this document and expressed that they also wanted us to keep it, and then to share it with other boys who are juvenile offenders in other countries so that they can learn from their stories. And the last, which was the most important piece of work, which is important in terms of clinical implications, is naming the opposition team. So these were like addiction and drug dependence and extortion and exploitation by police and such were probably the first time that the boys were sitting in front of the staff face to face in that institution and being able to recognize what really scares them and what interferes with them maintaining a sense of safety once they leave the home. And more importantly, when they are in the home, what are some of the fears that keep them from recovering? So I know I'm out of time. So one of the biggest implications, I think, of this work is that there is scope for reformation and not just punishment in a social justice-informed psychosocial intervention. although it's a very hard to study population, we found that boys are very encouraged to participate and share their stories, and that it's also possible to have a very old 60-year-old white woman come in who could have been perceived with a lot of suspicion, as was initially the case, but eventually who became kind of this instiller of hope and change. And I'll just end with that quote. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I ran out of time.
So the sad news is that we've run out of time. The good news is we still have 15 minutes left with treats and a reception so that you can continue to ask those Srishti questions as well as the rest of our speakers. But I also want to just thank all of you